What happened when I discovered that my husband's business expenses were actually luxury gifts, not for himself, but for his work wife? And I decided to make sure every single one of them ended up costing him exactly what they were worth. The first receipt showed up in the laundry basket, oddly crisp against the pile of gym socks and t-shirts. I almost tossed it back into the hamper without looking, until I noticed the vendor name, Aurelia & Co. Beside it, the charge, $1,250. The line item read, Corporate Appreciation, VIP. My thumb paused over the print as if it might burn me. By then, I'd learned not to jump. In the 7 years Taylor and I had been together, our money had been one of those quiet, negotiable trust exercises. Who pays the utilities, how we divvy the weekend groceries, what counts as date night. He had always been meticulous with his finances, the kind of man who categorized Starbucks under meetings and labeled the dog groomer as pet wellness. So, when a receipt for 4-figure floral arrangements appeared in a pile of his business expense reports, I noted it and moved on. People buy flowers for clients, I told myself. Maybe he's wooing an important vendor. Maybe it's a holiday thing. Maybe. But then 2 more receipts were waiting in my inbox the next morning, attached to an expense report he'd emailed to our joint accounting app. One read concierge gift, thank you. The other, luxury care package, client success. Both charged to Aurelia and Cober. Different locations, different dates, same handwriting in the memo line. For A, that little initial hit like a fingernail across glass. The first time you suspect something, your brain insists on innocence. The second time, it starts building playlists of explanations. The third time, you stop being gullible. Taylor, I said casually at breakfast, setting my mug down in front of him. Who's A? He didn't look up from his toast. A vendor from the Summit Conference. I had to close the loop. With gifts, I tried for light $400 bouquets. He snorted, the quick defensive sound of a man being minimized. It's called stewardship, Jules. You don't appreciate the power of touch points in business. The bouquet signals attention. He said the word bouquet like it was a unit of corporate strategy. I tasted something I couldn't name. More than indignation, less than panic. Can I see the expense line? I asked. He slid his phone away like a car dealer folding a hand. It's in the app. Go look. I opened the app. The receipts were there, neatly docketed. The notes were the same. VIP, appreciation, A. There was a consistent pattern of small vendor names, boutique floral houses, a luxury chocolate shipper, an executive personal concierge. None of them had easily searchable corporate websites. None of them had the impersonal tax IDs of the vendors Taylor normally used for legitimate office swag. When I called one of the floral houses, trying to sound as if I were a PR manager wanting references, the woman who answered the line had a lilting voice and an address in a part of the city I didn't recognize. Yes, we do corporate clients, she said. We also do personal work. We schedule deliveries to residences with instructions to leave on balcony or ring twice and wait. Her tone said she'd had these conversations 100 times. I asked, do you bill to corporate accounts often? She laughed. More often than you'd think. I didn't tell Taylor I'd called. I didn't tell him about the way the woman had paused before the word residences, as if she and the men she served had an unspoken map. I didn't tell him that I'd found a line on one invoice that read, delivery to unknown, access code provided, and my stomach had dropped into the part of me that records bad dreams. You learn to notice the pattern before you have the vocabulary for it. A vendor that only delivers late. A memo line that uses an initial. A charge that always appears on the company card the week before he calls a weekend business trip. Those are not generally business expenses. Those are curated signals. I started looking for other things. Little things. A faint perfume on his scarf that didn't belong to me. A sugar packet in his coat pocket with a logo from a restaurant I'd never heard of. A screenshot on his laptop left open one morning. An email thread between Taylor H. and Aurelia Concierge in which someone had written, casually, she loved the roses. Keep this on file. When I finally said the word aloud, are you seeing someone? He slammed his cereal bowl into the sink like it was a gavel. No, he said it the way men say things they believe to be unarguable truth. It's all business. But business people don't ask a concierge to keep this on file with a wink. Business people don't dispatch luxury care packages under a veil of appreciation and address them with a single intimate initial. Business people don't leave cards on a bedside table that smell like the floral house and a perfume I'd never wear. That night, I didn't storm. I didn't point fingers. I sat on the living room floor with a pile of receipts arrayed before me like evidence on a small, dreamy altar. Oldness of trust is not dramatic. It's arithmetic. The sums added up. The charges spiked the week he traveled. The vendor names changed, but kept the same habit. Boutique, private, contact through email. My brain, which had kept account of every domestic triviality for years, made the leap. The business expenses were not for his business, and A was not a client. I went to sleep cataloging options. Confrontation, I decided, was a blunt instrument. It would make him defensive. It would fragment our finances. And above all, it would give him performance fuel, his preferred territory. If he was being performative, I thought, I would perform more quietly and with better props. By morning, a plan had softened into shape. I am not a vengeful person by temperament. I am procedural. If something has cost you trust, then the remedy must balance cost and clarity. I wanted him to feel what his choices had really cost him. Not thundered at the dinner table, but exacted, matched, and visible. I would make sure every single one of his little curated gestures landed somewhere that would sting him in the place he considered invulnerable. His wallet, his professional reputation, and the arithmetic that had convinced him these were business expenses. First, I would track every vendor, not with the aim of exposing him over cocktails, but to understand who A was and whether those vendors had corporate standing or were personal fronts. Second, I would start redirecting his currency, not sabotaging it, but making sure the cost of the gifts didn't translate into secret advantage. If he'd paid for a 4-figure bouquet with corporate cards, I would call call the company's accounting policy hotline and request a clarification on appropriate client gifting. If the company wrote it off, they needed to know how intimate their vendor list had become. I'd learned over the years that bureaucracies are ambivalent creatures. They hate scandal, but they cannot stand ambiguity. The neatest way to shepherd a man back into the light is to make the darkness administratively inconvenient. Make it taxable, make it auditable, make it feel like work. But that was a game of levers, and I also needed a softer weapon, one he could feel without the spreadsheet. I started compiling a little notebook of memory marks, dates he was late, the times he'd suppressed my questions, the nights I'd been made to feel like a shadow. Not for a courtroom, not even strictly for him, for myself, to remind me why I would not double for the illusion he was buying. My plan required patience. It required me to be boring in the way a seasoned accountant is boring. Methodical, patient, and unromantic. It also required me to be brave in the way women our mothers taught us not to be. To ask for receipts, to call vendors, to put our hands where men assumed no one would look. The first small step was that I asked HR, casually, about the company's gift policy on my way to make coffee. The HR manager smiled, gave me the standard corporate line about compliance, and then, because humans are sometimes stupidly helpful, actually forwarded me the corporate policy document. It was antiseptic and bureaucratic and thrilling. There were lines about thresholds for gifts, about approval hierarchies, about documentation required for anything over $75. If someone's billing what odd 250 bouquets as VIP appreciation, she told me, lowering her voice across the cubicle, they're either bilking the company or they're mislabeling something dozen times over. Either way, filing a ticket is easy. She tapped at her keyboard and said nothing more. I left with a policy in my inbox like a small weapon. That night, Taylor came home late again, smelling of something like cedar and sugar. He laughed at a podcast while he poured himself a drink, oblivious. He kissed me because that's what people who feel safe do. After a while, the reassurance becomes ritual. I kissed him back like someone rehearsing for a role she'd decided to keep. Inside, I had that ledger open. Suppliers, dates, memos. I knew how many times he'd used the company card for concierge charges, and I knew what would happen when a compliance ticket landed in his manager's inbox. Also had something else, one stubborn moral sign. The moves I was about to make weren't about humiliation. They were about calibration. If you treat corporate funds as discretionary love letters, then I would make sure those letters arrived at an address of consequence. If you blurred the line between work and personal appetite, the line would be clarified with the cold logic of policy and the warm light of true accountability. And if, in the process, Taylor found out what his little rituals were worth, if he realized the arithmetic of what he'd bought in secrecy, I wanted him to feel not the performance of indignation, but the small, patient weight of what he'd traded for that thrill. I closed the notebook, slid the receipts back into the drawer beside my toothbrush, and slept. The plan was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was a correction. Part of me still wanted to salvage what love had been, but another part of me wanted to teach a man who thought he could hide in spreadsheets that finance, like fidelity, is ultimately about transparency. The next morning, I woke before Taylor. He was sprawled across the bed, his hand draped over my side like an absent-minded claim. His phone was on the nightstand, face down but still warm from use. I stared at it for a long minute, not because I wanted to check it, that would have been too obvious, but because I realized I didn't need to anymore. I already had everything I needed. I got up quietly, made coffee, and opened my laptop at the kitchen counter. The company compliance portal was a marvel of bureaucracy. Stiff fonts, color-coded tabs, every field begging for precision. I filled it in carefully. Potential misuse of corporate card funds, gifts exceeding approval threshold, repeat vendor pattern, possible mislabeling of expenses as business-related. I attached digital copies of 3 receipts. No commentary, no accusation, just documentation. At the bottom, where it asked if I wished to remain anonymous, I checked yes. When I hit submit, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like a surgeon finishing the first incision, the kind of calm that only comes after you've decided there's no going back. 2 days later, Taylor mentioned that finance had requested clarification on a few charges. He said it offhandedly while checking his watch, the way people mention minor inconveniences, like a parking ticket or a lost package. Probably some intern running an audit, he said. They don't know how client relations works. I just nodded. Probably. He didn't notice the small smile that pulled at the corner of my mouth. By the end of that week, the audit had turned into a full internal review. Someone in accounting had flagged the pattern. Personal vendors, high-value gifts, inconsistent expense categories. His manager had been looped in. Compliance had opened what they called a level 2 inquiry. At dinner, Taylor's confidence had begun to fray. They're overreacting, he said, stabbing at his steak. It's corporate nonsense. Everyone sends thank you gifts, maybe, I said, but not everyone gets caught. He glared at me, fork midair. What's that supposed to mean? I shrugged, nonchalant. You just sound stressed. Maybe you should stop sending those gifts for a while. He sighed, exasperated. Jules, this is what I do. I build relationships. I can't exactly show up empty-handed to a pitch. Then maybe you should use your own card next time. His fork clinked against the plate. What's your deal lately? I smiled softly, just paying attention. That night, while he was in the shower, I went to the drawer where he kept his receipts and business cards. He'd added new ones, different vendors this time. One was a boutique in the West Village. The name was handwritten across a glossy ivory card. Aurelia Concierge, discretion, detail, delivery. I turned it over. On the back, in small, elegant script, was a tagline. We take care of what you can't explain. That line hit me like a physical chill. Whoever A was, she wasn't just a fling. She was part of a pattern, a lifestyle. Taylor wasn't hiding one affair. He was financing an ecosystem of convenience and secrecy. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me strategic. The next morning, I stopped by my bank before work. I hadn't touched our joint savings in years. Most of it was my salary, but Taylor had set up the account for simplicity. He handled the transfer. transfers, the balances, the autopays, the kind of domestic outsourcing that looks like trust but feels like dependency. Hi, I said to the banker, sliding my ID across the counter. I'd like to create a separate account, just in my name, and I'd like to transfer a portion of my deposits there automatically. How much? She asked. All of them, I said. Effective immediately. By noon, my direct deposit was rerouted. The savings account still bore both our names, but it was hollow now, a shell with my signature attached. 2 days later, he came home early. That never happened. He was flustered, red around the collar. Can you believe this? He said, waving a printout from HR. They're freezing my card. They're saying I need to reimburse the company until they review the receipts. Oh no, I said, pouring him a drink. How much? He hesitated. About 15 grand. I raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of appreciation. He glared. It's not what it looks like. I tilted my head. Then what is it? He opened his mouth, closed it, ran his hands through his hair. It's complicated. Complicated, I repeated. Right. We stood there in the living room, the distance between us suddenly measurable. He was sweating, trembling slightly, not because he cared that I might suspect him, but because the consequences had finally landed somewhere tangible. Jules, he said quietly, I need you to trust me. I laughed. That's rich. Do you have a receipt for that too? The next day, his manager called him in. The internal memo went around within hours. Employee suspended pending compliance investigation. It didn't say why, but everyone knew. The whispers traveled faster than emails ever could. He came home furious. Someone's sabotaging me, he said, pacing the living room. They don't just audit random employees. Someone tipped them off. I watched him, sipping my tea. Maybe they just noticed the receipts. He turned. You think this is funny? No, I said. I think it's predictable. He blinked. What are you saying? I'm saying actions have prices. You've been billing yours to the wrong account. His eyes narrowed. You did this. I met his stare steady. No, Taylor, you did this to yourself. I just stopped covering the cost. For 3 weeks, he fought it. Meetings, emails, appeals. But the thing about corporate machines is that once they smell impropriety, they devour you methodically. They don't care about intention, only evidence. And he had plenty. The receipts, the timestamps, the boutique vendors, the personalized deliveries to a private address listed under Client A. By the end of the month, his company had issued a formal termination. Misuse of corporate funds, no severance, no reference. He came home that night with a cardboard box of desk items, a framed photo of us, a pen set, a few old business cards. He looked hollow. They ruined me, he said quietly. No, I said. You did that when you started confusing deceit for skill. He looked up, his voice breaking. I made a mistake. I nodded. Yes, and you finally paid for it. But I wasn't done, not yet, because while his job was gone, the truth about his affair still wasn't public. And I had one last envelope left to open, one last vendor on my list, Aurelia Concierge. I picked up the phone and called the number on the back of the card. Hi, I said calmly when a woman answered. I'd like to close out my husband's account. There was a pause. Your husband? Yes, Taylor H. I'm sure you have him on file. Another pause. Then, carefully, would you like me to send a statement to the billing address on record? Yes, I said, please. Make sure it includes every purchase, every delivery. Of course, she said. We'll send it to Mrs. H then? I smiled. Yes, please do. That night, I set the table for one. Taylor texted that he'd be home late. He had errands. I poured myself a glass of wine and waited. The statement from Aurelia Concierge would arrive in 2 days. And when it did, when he saw that I'd seen everything, I knew exactly how I would respond. Not with yelling, not with tears, with invoices, because if he turned our marriage into a transaction, then I'd make sure every line item balanced before I was done. The envelope from Aurelia & Co. arrived on a Wednesday morning, thick and cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering that almost dared me to open it. It had the kind of quiet luxury that makes you feel poorer just touching it. I carried it to the kitchen table, set it down beside my coffee, and just looked at it for a while. That envelope was the sum of everything I hadn't wanted to believe. All the late meetings, the networking dinners, the weekends away, all the little lies that had passed between us like currency. When I finally opened it, the first page hit harder than any confrontation could have. Account summary. Client, Mr. Taylor H. Billing. Period, 14 months. Total purchases, $48,672. I had to reread that number. $48,000, nearly 50 grand in gifts, arrangements, travel bookings, spa reservations, and personal client services. The next line nearly made me laugh. Primary recipient, Ms. A. Van. There it was. A name. I flipped the page. The list was meticulous. Itemized like a museum exhibit of betrayal. Luxury floral delivery. 1275 private car service to JFK. 240 suite reservation. The Langham 1920 pearl bracelet. Valentina Atelier. 3650 weekend itinerary. Montauk special. Request 2 guests. 4800. It went on and on and on. By the time I reached page 6, my hands had gone completely still. The last line item was dated 2 weeks before his business trip to Boston. Item. Retreat package. 2 nights. Couples massages. Champagne on arrival. Location. The same spa I'd once asked him to take me to for our anniversary. Cost. $2,960. There wasn't any more room for denial. The receipts had told me one story. This was the novel. He came home that night later than usual, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and stress. I was sitting at the table, the envelope open, the statement spread out in front of me like a confession he hadn't yet written. He froze when he saw it. Jules, he said carefully, what's that? I didn't answer. I just pushed the papers toward him. Your business expenses. His face drained of color. He scanned the top page, eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. Where did you get this? They sent it, I said, to the billing address on file. My address? He sank into the chair opposite me. You shouldn't have what? I cut him off. Opened mail addressed to Mrs. H. His lips parted, but no sound came out. You used our money, Taylor, I said quietly. You used my money. Our joint account paid that card balance every month. You bought her jewelry, vacations, private drivers, and then you called it business. He rubbed his temples. It's not what it looks like. That line again. The last refuge of cowards. It looks, I said evenly, like you've been funding your mistress for over a year with shared finances and company money, which means you've committed fraud in more ways than one. He slammed his hands on the table. Stop saying that word. I didn't flinch. Fraud? Because that's exactly what it is. He tried then the way cheaters do when they realize the game is over. He begged. Then he blamed. Then he minimized. She's just someone from work, he said. You know how lonely things got after your mother died. It wasn't serious. I never meant to hurt you. Every sentence was a patchwork of guilt and manipulation, designed to make me feel responsible for his choices. You didn't mean to hurt me? I asked. Taylor, you meant to get away with it. That's the only thing you ever meant. He dropped his head into his hands. I've lost everything. The job, my reputation. Please, Jules, don't take a house too. That was the first time he'd admitted it out loud. I've lost everything. It should have felt satisfying. It didn't. It just felt like silence finally catching up to him. That weekend, I met with a lawyer, a woman named Rivera. Sharp, efficient, calm, in a way that made me instantly trust her. Financial infidelity is still infidelity, she said after I explained. You can prove it easily. These invoices, the timing, the shared funds. He's not just cheating, he's misappropriating marital assets. Which means you'll get your half, she said, and then some. We spent 3 hours drafting paperwork. By the time I left her office, the plan had taken on a new clarity. I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was closing a balance sheet. When I got home, Taylor was in the living room staring at a blank TV screen. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but morally. The kind of small that happens when lies start collapsing inward. Where were you? He asked. Meeting with someone who knows the law better than you do, I said. His face fell. You're divorcing me. Yes. He swallowed hard. Can we at least talk about this? We are talking, I said. You just don't like the terms. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. His company formally filed charges for expense fraud. HR had forwarded the Aurelia invoices as part of their internal case. Word spread. His LinkedIn went quiet. His phone stopped buzzing. And then, one night around midnight, I got an email from A. Van, our subject line, "You deserve to know." I hesitated before opening it. When I finally did, there were no pleasantries, no excuses, just one line. He told me you were separated. I'm sorry. I ended it months ago. Attached were photos, not of them together, but of receipts, messages, and handwritten notes in Taylor's handwriting. One of them read, "She'll never find out. You're my real life." I didn't reply. I just forwarded it to my lawyer with a subject line, "Additional documentation. The divorce went through in 6 months. The house, half mine. The car, mine. The joint savings, liquidated, split. The retirement fund, frozen pending audit of fraudulent contributions." He tried to fight it at first, tried to guilt me into talking things out, but every time he saw me, calm and composed, with every receipt filed and every account number memorized, he realized there was nothing left to argue. He'd always been the one with control over the money, the narrative, the explanations. Now, control belonged to the only person he'd underestimated. 6 months after the settlement, a small brown envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a gift receipt from Aurelia & Co. It read, "Refund processed, $1,275, credited to card ending in 8894. That was my card. At the bottom, in neat cursive, was a handwritten note. "Consider it even." AVI smiled, not because I needed the money, but because poetic justice has a taste all its own. The last I heard of Taylor, he'd moved 2 states away working as a consultant. His reputation never fully recovered. Neither did his arrogance. But me, I rebuilt quietly. Different apartment, different job, new checking account, this time under one name and mine. And sometimes, when I file my own receipts at the end of the month, I write 2 words in the memo line. A small reminder, a private victory, paid in full. I hadn't thought about her, A. Van, in nearly a year. After the divorce, I'd buried that entire chapter under layers of new life. A smaller apartment with windows that caught morning light. A new job with an all-women team that thrived on brutal honesty. And a sense of peace that didn't depend on anyone's approval. I wasn't healed. Healing is a process, not a milestone. But I was living again. Then one Thursday afternoon, during a business networking event at a downtown co-working space, I heard a voice I hadn't expected to ever hear in real life. "Excuse me, Julia?" I turned, and there she was. A. Van. The name from the invoices, the ghost from my old marriage, standing there in a navy dress and a conference badge clipped to her lapel. For a heartbeat, I didn't recognize her as the woman I'd built up in my head, the one who ruined my life, the invisible rival. She wasn't dazzling or sultry or smug. She looked tired, human. She hesitated before speaking again. "You're Julia H., right? Or sorry, Julia Rivers now?" "Yes," I said slowly. "And you're—" She nodded, offering a hand that trembled slightly. "Alyssa." The room around us faded into background noise. Polite laughter, the clink of glasses, the low hum of networking small talk. "I wasn't sure if I should come over," she said, "but I've wanted to talk to you for a long time." I studied her face. There was no trace of arrogance, no smug satisfaction, just guilt and exhaustion and something almost like relief. "Well," I said, gesturing toward a quieter corner, "you found me, so talk." We sat at a small table by the window, 2 women who had once been on opposite sides of a very expensive lie. She started slowly. "I didn't know about you." "Not really. He told me you were separated. He said you were still living together for financial reasons, but it was over." I didn't question it because I wanted to believe him. Her voice broke on that last word. "You worked with him?" I asked. She nodded. "At first, yeah. I was his client. Marketing contract. Then he started helping me network. He paid for dinners, flights, gifts. He said it was part of the company's hospitality budget." I gave a humorless laugh. "That budget's what got him fired." She looked down. "I know. I found out the same week he lost his job. He told me you'd ruined him, that you'd turned everyone against him. Did you believe him?" She took took a long breath for about a week. Then I started checking my email, found invoices with my name on them, corporate cards, company addresses. Everything he told me was a lie. She pulled something from her purse, a small white envelope folded over. I've kept this for months. I didn't know what to do with it. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note in Taylor's neat, calculated handwriting. Alyssa, I'll make this right. You mean everything to me. Jules doesn't matter anymore. There it was again. My name, reduced to shorthand for collateral damage. He said that a lot, she murmured. That you didn't matter. That you were cold, controlling, distant. The irony is, he used those same words about his boss later, about his next client, about everyone who stopped feeding his ego. I folded the note back up. He had a pattern. You weren't the first. I wasn't even the only one. She looked startled. There were others. At least 2 that I know of, I said. Different states, different jobs. He always used the same formula. Charm, attention, financial generosity. Then guilt. Then control. She pressed her lips together. He drained my savings. I thought I was investing in us. Moving cities, helping him after he lost his job. By the time I realized what was happening, I was $12,000 in credit card debt. There it was. The other side of the balance. Sheet. You were a victim too, I said quietly. Alyssa shook her head. I was complicit. I believed what I wanted to believe. I saw the signs and chose the fantasy. I thought about that. About the nights I'd done the same. Rationalizing his behavior, telling myself he was just busy, stressed, working late. Maybe that's what women like us had in common. We believed in potential longer than we should have. We talked for almost an hour. The conversation moved from grief to absurdity to the strange kind of sisterhood that sometimes forms in the wreckage of the same man. At one point, she smiled ruefully. You know, he told me you were obsessed with control, that you monitored everything he did. I laughed. I didn't monitor him enough, apparently. She shook her head. No, I think he said that because he hated being accountable. You were the one person who could see through him, and that terrified him. That landed deeper than I wanted to admit. We finished our drinks. As we stood to leave, she said something that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. I used to think revenge meant getting even. Now I think it means getting free. I nodded. And freedom's a hell of a lot more satisfying than revenge. That night, I went home and dug through an old box in my closet, the one I'd kept labeled evidence. Inside were the original receipts, the Aurelia invoices, the corporate memos. For months, I'd held on to them like relics, proof of what I'd survived. But now, looking at them, I realized I didn't need proof anymore. I had closure. I grabbed a lighter from the kitchen drawer, went out onto the balcony, and one by one, I burned them. The papers curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the smoke rising into the city air. Each one was a little piece of my old self, the woman who waited, doubted, overanalyzed, forgave too easily. When the last page burned away, I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, just release. 2 months later, I got a postcard. No return address, just a photo of a seaside town and a single line written on the back. Started over, debt's gone. Thank you for listening. A. I smiled, folded the postcard in half, and tucked it into my journal. Maybe we both needed that conversation more than we'd realized. 2 women once orbiting the same lie, finally free of its gravity. A few weeks after that, I started my own business. Small at first. Financial consulting for women leaving marriages or long-term partnerships. The tagline I chose for my website was simple. Transparency is power. It wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching women what I had to learn the hard way. That understanding your money means understanding your worth. And somewhere, I hoped Alyssa found the same piece. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come in courtrooms or spreadsheets. It comes in the quiet, mutual recognition between 2 people who were once fooled by the same man, and who refused to let him define the ending of their stories. 3 years later, my mornings looked nothing like they used to. There was no rush to iron shirts that weren't mine, no half-cold coffee left behind after someone's important meeting. Instead, there was silence, the kind that didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt earned. My business had grown, beyond what I'd imagined that first night I'd scribbled transparency is power in a notebook. What started as a small service helping women trace missing money and unfair divorces had become a consultancy. 15 clients a month, referrals from attorneys, accountants, even journalists. Women who came to me with trembling voices and shoeboxes full of receipts, the same way I once did. They called me the forensic therapist. I liked that, because what I really did wasn't about revenge or recovery. It was about rebuilding. Every file was a variation of my own story. A woman who didn't see the credit cards her husband opened in her name. A fiancé whose joint investment turned out to be a second mortgage. A mother who'd given up her career to support his dream, only to find herself erased from their own bank account. When they came to me, I didn't just crunch numbers. I told them what nobody had told me, that their pain had math behind it. That betrayal could be quantified, documented, and turned into leverage. It was on one of those quiet afternoons between client calls that I met Daniel. He was a referral, not a client, but a business contact. He ran a small law firm that specialized in ethical finance, and he'd reached out about partnering for a workshop. His first email was short and professional. Your tagline caught my attention. I think we speak the same language. We met for coffee in a sunlit cafe that smelled like cinnamon and paper. He was tall, calm, and spoke with the measured patience of someone who listened more than he talked. When he asked about my work, I told him the short version, the sanitized one I usually gave strangers. But then he asked something nobody had asked me before. What made you start it? I paused. The easy answer was a bad marriage, but that wasn't the truth anymore. I started it because women like me get told we're emotional when we're just underinformed, I said. Because men like my ex use complexity as camouflage. Because if you know where your money goes, you know where your power goes. He smiled, slow and genuine. You talk like an accountant with a poet's heart, or a poet with trust trust issues, I said, and he laughed. Not the polite kind, but the kind that means someone actually gets it. And our collaboration turned into a friendship. Workshops turned into late-night planning sessions. Late nights turned into long walks home, then into dinners, and eventually into something that felt terrifyingly beautifully easy. Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't buy grand gestures or expensive distractions. He was transparent. He showed me receipts without me asking. He told me when he'd made mistakes before I noticed them. He didn't promise perfection. He offered consistency. And I realized that's what I'd been craving all along. Not a man who could impress me. A man who could match me. The first time I let him into my apartment, he stopped at the door and said, "You live like someone who trusts herself." I hadn't thought about it that way before, but he was right. The place was small, simple, full of light, and every single thing in it had been bought, built, or repaired by me. No illusions, no lies, just clarity. A year into our relationship, he asked me to teach a seminar with him at a local university. Ethics of Money and Emotion. We co-taught it to a room full of graduate students who still thought trust was the default setting. I told them this. Love without transparency is theater, and theater without an audience is just rehearsal for heartbreak. They laughed, some nervously, but a few nodded in the kind of way that told me they just filed something away for later. Afterward, one young woman lingered to thank me. She said, "You made me realize I've been scared to check my own bank statements." I smiled at her and said, "Start there. That's where all revolutions begin. In the numbers." Months later, Daniel proposed, quietly, no grand speeches, no fireworks, just a dinner at home, candles, and a small velvet box that he placed beside my plate like a question waiting to be answered. He said, "This time, you can check every receipt. I want you to see everything before you say yes." I laughed, half crying. "God, you really know how to speak my love language." He smiled. "It's called full disclosure." We got married 2 years later. No big wedding, just a ceremony by the ocean, a handful of friends, my father, and one unexpected guest, Alyssa. She showed up with a bouquet of magnolias and a shy smile. "I heard you were getting married," she said. "I thought you might want the flowers to mean something this time." I hugged her and we both laughed, that kind of laughter that only comes from two people who survived the same storm and found different shores. After the ceremony, as the waves crashed behind us and Daniel squeezed my hand, I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed along the way. The woman who ignored the first receipt, the woman who submitted the compliance report, the woman who watched her marriage burn down in a slow, quiet fire, the woman who built something new from the ashes, not a story of revenge, but of responsibility. And for the first time, I felt something like pride, because every version of me had done her job. Later that night, as the guests left and the candles flickered low, Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You still keep records, don't you?" I smiled. "Always. But now, I keep the good ones too." He kissed me softly and said, "Then keep this one. First night of our life built on truth." Years from now, when people ask me why I started my business, why I stayed calm when I had every reason to explode, why I didn't burn everything down, I'll tell them this: because fire destroys fast, but light, real, steady light, changes everything it touches. And because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't ruining someone else's life. It's building one so transparent, so steady, and so free that the person who betrayed you could never survive inside it. I never kept the old receipts after that. I didn't need proof anymore. I was the proof. The end.